Today, we're going to be creating a custom objective pulse device that shows a line pointing players in the direction they need to go to complete different objectives. And to make it, we're going to be using one of the most important new tools in UEFN, Scene Graph. If you haven't already started to learn Scene Graph, don't worry, we're going to be covering the basics in this tutorial. By the end, you'll understand not just how Scene Graph functions, but how you can actually use it to create helpful mechanics. But first, if you're not already in the Map Creator Success Program, then you're going to want to listen up because you could be missing out on saving yourself a lot of time and money. It's our all-in-one program where you get access to a ton of different tools and content that is crafted specifically to help Fortnite map creators. From our full content library with over 100 different burst scripts to daily support from UEFN experts, I can almost guarantee you that there is at least something in this program that you will find extremely beneficial. And the best part is that we're updating this program every single month, and we have been for almost 2 years now. So you can either spend weeks or months making and debugging your own mechanics, or you can join the Creator Success Program and start making the maps you want to make faster than ever before. So what are you waiting for? Join the hundreds of other creators that are skipping the hard part and making incredible maps that are generating real money. The link is in the description. Anyways, let's get right into the video. Okay, so to create our custom Objective Pulse device using Scene Graph, we are first going to need an actual VFX that we'll use as the Objective Pulse. I already went ahead and created one here. I am not a VFX expert, so I am not going to try to explain how this works. If you want to watch a video on it, I'm going to have the video that I use to create this VFX, and the link will be in the description. There are some changes to it, so if you want this specific VFX, then I'll be providing the download. All you have to do is join the free Discord. There'll be a link in the description below. There's no strings attached. You can just join and download this file. So you want to go and do this first and make sure you have it. Basically, how this works is, I'll just go ahead and place it down actually. We have this VFX here, and it's just going to draw a line from the player's position here, which is a parameter we have, to the first element, or it'll draw lines to all of the different elements in our position data array. So let's say we set this to like 200, 200, 200, like so. You can see it's now drawing a line in that direction. So we have these two parameters that actually allow us to control how the line is going to work. Now what we need to do is control these, and the only way you can actually control Niagara parameters at the moment is using Scene Graph. So this is almost necessary for this to work. Technically, there's some other ways you can do it if you use a material with material parameter controls, but this is going to be the best way, and this way we don't have to create a bunch of different VFXs, and it's much more simple, and it's much more reusable. So I'm going to go and delete this VFX because we don't actually need it, and we're going to hop into creating our prefab. If you're on an old project, you need to enable Scene Graph. So you go to your project check settings and enable the Scene Graph system. We don't need any of the experimental access features for this to work. Then we want to go to our content drawer, and inside of this, we can make a new folder if you want to organize, but I'll just make it in my main content folder. And you want to right click and click Entity Prefab Definition. And I'll select this, and this is going to be basically our device, what we're going to be able to place down in the world and it create the map indicator pulse for players. So what I'll do is call this our Objective Pulse Prefab. Now, if I go ahead and open this up, you'll see there's nothing here at the moment. So we need to go ahead and first select our Objective Pulse Prefab here. I'm not going to go super in depth into Scene Graph in this tutorial. I'm more going to focus on what needs to be explained to actually create this Objective Pulse, and I'll try to explain that the best I can. But there's obviously a lot more that can be done with Scene Graph that I'm not going to go over in this tutorial. So once I select this, this is a prefab, but at the same time, it is also called an entity. So with Scene Graph, you have entities and components. And if you know Verse or you followed any of the reverse tutorials, then you can kind of think as the entity or our prefab as the same thing as a Verse device. So whenever you build Verse code and you drag and drop the Verse device out, that's basically the same thing as a prefab, except in a Verse device, all you have is the different editable options, and all of those are only in Verse. Whereas a prefab, you still have access to make your own Verse scripts to put inside of it, but there's other settings as well. Like, for example, you could add meshes and lights and VFXs and things like that, and they're going to be part of this prefab. Whereas in the Verse device, you can't actually change the mesh of the Verse device or add anything else to it. If you don't know Verse, then you can kind of imagine it as kind of like a bucket, and we're going to put other things inside of it, and then we can copy and paste that bucket, and it's going to keep everything inside of it and do all the actions that we set inside of it. So this is also kind of an entity. If we go ahead and add a component here, we have quite a few options. Again, I'm not going to explain all of these options, just the ones that we need. I'll start by adding a mesh component, as that's kind of the most simple. And then if you want, you can add a custom mesh by going and creating it and using the modeling mode, but I'm just going to create a cylinder. And here we only have a couple options. I'm going to want to use a custom one. So I'll just go into my main UEFN and minimize that for now, and go into modeling mode and create a cylinder and place it down. Here we'll change the size of it, but then I'm just going to go ahead and accept, and then go to select. And then if we go into our new meshes folder that should exist, we have our cylinder here. We're going to change the material to like a translucent. This is going to be used as like the objective zone that it's pointing towards. So I'll save this and then close that. So now if we go back and we add a component here to our objective prefab, we'll select our mesh component, and we might not see the option here. And that is because we actually need to minimize that and build verse code so that is actually available in verse code, because SceneGraph is going to read from verse code to know what assets we have available. So now it should be that if we go back into our objective pulse and now add a mesh component, we have this cylinder that we just created. Perfect. Now inside of this, if we want, we can kind of change the size. I'll go more like this, just make it a little wider, and we can save. So now simply we have our main prefab, and it's got a singular component, and it's got our mesh component, and because we have a mesh, it automatically created a transform component as well. So if we minimize this, we can actually just go back. Let's go and delete our mesh because we don't need it. Then we can just drag and drop our prefab, and boom, now we have this. We can copy and paste it. Pretty simple. It works the same way as a blueprint prop so far. If we go back into our prefab though, there's more we can do with this, right? We can add more components on top of this, which we're going to do in a second, but I really want to cover, we're not going to use in this tutorial, but the main advantage to SceneGraph is the fact that you can create a hierarchy of different entities. So a prefab and an entity, you can kind of think of it as the same thing. They work the same, like this prefab is an entity here. The only difference for like prefab versus entity is that a prefab is like going to be in your content drawer. It's like a big bucket. Entities are smaller buckets, and then components are the things inside of those buckets. So inside of this really big bucket, our prefab, we can have our smaller buckets that fit inside of it, which is our different entities. And then inside of those, we fill those with our items, which is going to be our components. So if you want to add another entity, you just right click here, go add entity, and then select entity. And now if we select this has its own components that are completely separate from our main entity here. So if we want, this can have its own mesh, this can have its own VFX or its own verse scripts, any of these. And then inside of verse, you can actually kind of control or find the different entities. In this tutorial, it's going to be quite simple. We're only going to use one entity, so I'll remove that new one. If you guys want to see more SceneGraph tutorials, make sure to like the video and let me know in the comments. I know there's not a lot out there right now, so maybe I can do some videos on raycasting or tracking collisions, things like that. So we're going to add some more components to this list. For now, I'm going to add a VFX, but we're actually going to spawn this in later. But just for the example, I will add a particle system component, and here we have our line VFX. You might get an error screen here, and if you do, that's because you don't have any VFX imported, or you haven't built verse code after you imported them. Because whenever you add either a mesh or a VFX component, it has to be set to a specific VFX or mesh. So inside of our line VFX, you can see we actually have our options, the player position, or our different parameters. So we have the player position and our points array, and you can see it's automatically generating here. So now we can actually go ahead and save that really quick and minimize. And if we drag a prefab back down, you can see we have that particle and we have the different settings for our prefab. So if we scroll down, we'll say the player's position, these are both not going to be local, but global positions. So the player's position and our points array are both going to be in the center here. So you can see all of our particles are at 0, 0. So really quickly, I'm just going to copy the position of, so if I want this from 0, 0, which is going to be our player's position, and we'll set our points array to the actual position of our prefab. So I'll just go to the local transform. Technically, this is going to be different if you're using this inside of an entity that's inside of another entity, but because it's a main prefab that's just in our entire simulation, then the local transform and our global transform are going to be basically the same thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this translation here and paste it here. And now you can see we have our lines going from 0 to 0 up here. And then maybe I'll change the height a little bit from 0 to like 90. And now you can see it's creating our kind of indicator pulse from 0 to our position. Very cool. This is confirming that it is working, and this is what the VFX is going to look like as kind of an example. But what else do we actually need to do? Well, let's go back into our prefab, and we need to now create a verse component that is going to set this player's position. So to create a verse component, I'll just click add component here and we'll select new verse component. And I will call this our Objective Indicator Component and hit create. This is going to be the exact same thing as if we created a verse file of type component. There's some different templates when you go to create a verse file. This is just a quicker way to do that. So this should open it up. The first thing I'm going to do is just clear all of these comments and the prints because we don't need them, along with our editable here. Let's just remove all of that. We're also going to remove the onSimulate function because we're only going to use onBeginSimulation here. So what do we want this to actually do? Well, we wanted to get the VFX. So what do we want this to do? Well, if we go back to our prefab, this has automatically been added. This might be glitched. If we close and reopen, this might not be here and we might need to re-add it. We'll see. But what we need to do here is basically have this component access our VFX, and both of these are under the same entity, and we want to set it to the player's position. So first we need to know what player it's actually being set to. So what I'll do is add an editable, and we'll call this our start indicator trigger. And it's just a trigger device. This is what we'll use to actually start showing this indicator to a player. And I'll go down here under onBeginSimulation and write start indicator trigger dot triggered event dot subscribe to start indicator. And then we'll go down here and create that new function called start indicator. And triggers, they send optional agents. So I'll call this our M agent for like maybe agent, and we'll make it an optional agent, and it doesn't need to return anything, so we'll return void. Now let's go ahead and actually convert this agent. So if we'll say our agent is equal to M agent, this just makes it actually possible to work with because our optional agent could be false or could be an agent. Doesn't know. This will just convert that. And then we're actually going to spawn another function because we're going to need to have a loop because we have to set the player's position every single tick. Currently, there's no good way to attach this directly to the player. So what I'll do is spawn a function called handle indicator, and I'll send it our agent. Now we do the exact same thing. We go down here, make our handle indicator function. This time we just take a normal agent because we already converted it up here before we sent it. And this will suspend of type void. And the reason we have it suspending is because this function does not activate instantly. It's going to have a sleep inside of it. It's going to take time to complete. That's also the reason why we spawn it up here. So inside of this function, what do we need to do? Well, we need to get this VFX that's inside of our prefab. So these are going to be some new functions if you've never messed with verse scene graph before. So get ready. First off, inside of our component, if I actually control click on this, it automatically has an entity that is attached to. So we could literally just write entity here, and this works. Like we have access to this entity that is going to be the entity that this component is attached to. So we can see that this objective indicator component, which is the same thing as this, it's attached to our prefab entity, which is this. So we have access to this. And then inside of entities, there's a lot of different functions that we actually have. But the one we're going to use here is dot get component. Pretty simple. We can just get one of the components, and then inside of this, we have to put what type of component we want to get. So some examples of this is like if we want to get our mesh component, we would simply write mesh component, right? And then because this is a decides, because this could fail, because sometimes, that component might not be in the entity, we'll put this in an if statement like so. And then obviously we can assign this to something. So we'll say our new component or something. And just like that, you get the mesh component that is inside of the same entity as our objective indicator component. Except here, obviously, that's not what we want. We don't care about the mesh component. What we do care about is our line VFX. So inside of this, we could either put particle system component, which is the name of the component, but this is just a general particle system, which means it doesn't know what parameters it has whenever we actually get this. So we have to do a second conversion. What's easier is we can get a specific particle system and it'll automatically convert for us. So all we have to do is put the name of our particle system. So our line VFX, like so. So now we have our VFX component is what I'm going to name this. Then we can go in here and say then. The other thing that we need is let's go ahead and just get the fort character. So I'll say our fort character is equal to agent.getFort character. And you can see we had an error there for a second, and that's just because you need to include Fortnite.com/characters. Anyway, now that we have the VFX component and the player, which will allow us to get the player's position, then we'll do a loop and sleep for 0 seconds. And we want to control the parameter inside of our VFX component, and we want to set it to our player's position. So first we'll get our player position is equal to our fc.getTransform.translation, like so. If you're curious about what these recommendations are, they're not very helpful right now, but the more code there is, the more helpful it is. It's called GitHub Copilot. I'd highly recommend it. But the next thing we need to do is actually control our parameters for the player position. And to do that, you simply write VFX component dot player position or player's position. We just write the name of our thing, like just the same way as you would any other variable, and we just write set because it's a variable, and we can set it equal to our player position like so. However, we are going to get an error here, and that is because verse sucks, and there's two different types of vector 3s. We have XYZ and left up forward. So we're here because whenever we get the player's position, that'll be XYZ, and our VFX component that we're actually setting it to is going to be left up forward. We're going to have to convert it, but it's not that big of a deal. So what we'll do is we'll write our new location is equal to vector 3, and we'll write the left is equal to the player position dot y, and this will be the negative. The up is going to be the player position dot z, and the forward is going to be the player position dot x. And here we get an error, and that is because we need to use one of the spatial maths. In this case, I'm going to be using the verse.org one, because that is going to be the left up forward. So now we simply set this to the new location instead, and all will work fine. If you're curious about what these, or how I got negative y, z, and x here, it's actually pretty simple. So if we look our left value here, and if we go back into UEFN, and we select something like this and hover over our local transform, you could select any prompt for this to work. We'll see the very first value, which is going to be the left. It was negative y. So simply in this, we just make our left the negative y. And then we do the same for the other two. Was z, was x. Pretty simple. So now this is just going to update the player's position inside of the VFX to our new location every single tick, because we're sleeping 0. All right, so now we're actually updating the player's position properly. The other thing we need to do is update the points array position. This is an array, but that's just because the VFX is made for arrays. However, in this tutorial, we only want to actually mess with the first element. So pretty simple. All we want to do is set this to the same position as our kind of local or global transform. They're going to be the same in this case because we're using the kind of root entity. However, we'll use the global transform because that will be the correct one. Anyway, so we just do the exact same thing as we did on here. We'll set the VFX component dot player's position, except not the player's position, but the points array. So dot points array, and we'll set the 0 element, the first element, and we need to set it equal to our new location, and simply to the position of the way to get the global transform of our entity. We'll write entity dot get global transform, and then this is a transform. We need to set it to a translation, so it's a vector 3, and just like that, it's now going to assign the location that it's pointed to wherever we actually place down this prefab. And just like this, it will now work. We're not done yet, but because there's some other things we need to do to make sure everything cleans up properly and also works well for multiplayer. So first, we need to make sure to clean up our event here. And the reason why is because if you're used to working with normal verse devices, you have the on begin. This is on begin simulation. They do not work the exact same. On begin simulation is actually going to start running before the game is even started. Before you hit start game, this is already running. And what that also means is that unlike regular verse devices, whenever the game ends, it's not just going to automatically clean up all the events for you. They're going to stay subscribed because they're outside of the scope of the current round. So we need to actually manually cancel this subscription whenever the simulation ends. So to do that, if you see subscribe, they actually returns a cancelable that allows us to cancel this subscription. And if you don't really know how like subscriptions work or anything like that, basically what we're saying here is that whenever our trigger gets triggered, whenever this event gets fired, well, then we're subscribing that event to our start indicator function. So whenever this gets triggered, well, then this is going to activate. And if we cancel this, right, we could just straight up do .cancel, then the subscription ends. So this event is no longer subscribed to this function and it won't happen anymore. But we don't want this to cancel automatically. What we want to do is get the subscription. So I'll say our start sub and we'll assign it equal to that. And then we need to keep track of this so we can end it later. So I'll make a variable of type up here and I'll call this our all cancellables and I'll make an array of cancelable like so. And we'll initialize it with an array. Then we'll simply add this start sub to our all cancellables array. So I will set all cancellables plus equal to array start sub. So now we actually have this cancelable tracked. We need to go down here and use this built-in function called onEnd simulation. Perfect, it already popped up there. Make sure to add the super here like so. I can't give you the best explanation as to why, but basically there's some other stuff that this onEnd simulation is going to do, and we want to make sure it still does that and not just whatever we put inside of this function with the override. So let's do whatever else onEnd simulation has to do first. Then we will go through every single cancelable inside of our all cancelable array, and we will do the cancelable.cancel like so. And I spelled it wrong, so that's why we got the error there. Boom, that's perfect. But we have one more issue, and that is our loop is still going to be running because this doesn't get canceled either. So what I'll do is just create a custom event. We'll go up here, I'll type EVT and press tab. You wonder why that works. It's because I have this verse language snippets extension. It's very helpful. I'd recommend it. If not, you can just copy the syntax here. And we'll call this our simulation ended event. We'll go down here and make sure that this is signaled. So .signal whenever the simulation actually ends. And then we need to make sure this loop ends whenever this simulation ended event is signaled. So what we want to do is have it race. So we will add a race like so, and we'll put our loop underneath the race. That's very important. And just to make it cleaner, I like to separate my races in with blocks always, even if it's just a couple lines. So I'll put two different blocks here, and then we'll write our simulation ended event dot await. And what this is doing and what races do is basically we're racing whatever is under this block and whatever is under this block. And if one of them ends, whatever gets to the end of their block, whatever finishes, well, then it's going to stop everything else that is under the race block. So in this case, this is just never going to end because it's an infinite loop. And this is going to signal whenever the simulation ends. So this will finish and this loop that we have. All right. Perfect. Now that is actually cleaned up properly, and this will technically work. There's some more I'm going to add to it to make sure it works for different players, and we're also going to change this so that we spawn in the VFX component. But for now, I'm going to really quick launch session just so we can make sure that this is functioning properly. So to make sure this functions, what we want to do is simply place down our prefab wherever we want. I'll actually delete that one. Place down our prefab here, and we don't need to set the position here at all. All we need to do is scroll down, and let's make sure we build verse code first. Then if we reselect this, our objective indicator component has our trigger. So I will grab a trigger device out from our content drawer, just throw it down here, and then we select our prefab again, and then select our trigger device. Now, if I launch session, we'll test this out. Okay, so now whenever I start game, if I go and hit our trigger, you can see we have this map indicator that is pointing towards our position, and it's constantly being updated to the player's position. Very cool, and it works well, but there's still quite a bit that we want to do because this is pretty limited in terms of actual use for gameplay. So let's end the game and go back into UEFN. Now, if we open up Verse, the first thing I'll do is add a stop indicator trigger. This will be pretty simple. We'll call this the stop indicator trigger, type trigger device, just like our other one. And then if we go down here, there's two ways we can do this. We can have it subscribed like the other one, or simply we can go down here to our race and actually just do a block, and we do a loop, and we do stop indicator trigger dot triggered event dot await, and we will say our stopping agent is equal to this, or our stopping M agent, because again triggers give an optional agent. Then we'll go down here and write if our stopping agent is equal to stopping M agent, like so. Then lastly, we want to check if the stopping agent happens to be the agent that this loop is currently running for. Well, then we'll break the loop, which will then end the race and end the other two things inside of this. Okay, so now we have a stop indicator trigger. Very nice. The next thing that we need to do is with multiplayer, if this trigger is triggered multiple times, well, there's only one VFX, so it can't be set to both players' position at the same time, and it'll kind of bug out. So what we want to do instead is actually go into our prefab and fully remove our align VFX. To remove a component, you click the add button here and click remove. So now if we go back into verse, we no longer actually have a line VFX component inside of our entity. So instead what we need to do is go up here and we will write our VFX component, and we will create a new line VFX component, and we'll make it of type line VFX, and it's equal to a line VFX, like so. And inside of this we get an error, and that's because it needs an entity. And what that means is the same way that our component here, if we double click, we have the entity which we've been using. Well, this is a default value. This needs to be assigned whenever we create a component. So we're making this line VFX component, and we need to assign it the entity. So we'll write the entity is equal to entity. Pretty simple. We're setting the line VFX entity equal to the entity of our objective indicator component. This does not automatically actually add this to our entity. We're just assigning this entity to this component. We now need to add this component to our entity. So I will write our entity dot add components. There is no add component. It has to be add components, which is an array. So we'll make an array and then add the VFX component to it, like so. So now this is a brand new component that we're creating whenever this function gets called, and this is what we're going to use instead. So now this should actually work with multiplayer, which is great. Well, the other thing we need to do is for our stop indicator trigger, is whenever our stop indicator trigger gets triggered and it ends this race, but we also want this to actually remove this VFX component. So there's two ways to do this. First, we can add all the logic for destroying this component here, but we don't want to do that. Instead, what you can do is assign the race to a value. So to do that, we're going to go down here and we'll do it after our race. So whenever this race ends, whether the simulation ended or the stop trigger is triggered, well, then we want to remove this component. So we'll write entity.remove from entity, remove components, and we'll write our VFX component dot remove from entity. And this is just a function that's built in that's going to automatically remove our VFX component from whatever entity is set here. Another quick thing that you can do in case there's the option for players to maybe trigger the start trigger multiple times is we'll just track the players who already have this indicator activated. So I'll make a variable and called already started agents of type array of agents, like so. Then I'm going to go down here and we'll go to handle indicator, or before we even spawn this, we'll check if not already started agents dot find agent, like so. So this just checks if this agent here is inside of this array. So, and then not is just reversing that. So if it's not inside of this array, then we'll spawn our handle indicator function. And inside of this, we will set the already started agents plus equal to array, and we'll add our agent. So we add it, and then down here, we are just going to remove it. And to remove it, we'll say if our new array, so we have to create a new array, and it's equal to the already started agents dot remove first element of our agent. So this is just going to create a new array that's our existing array, but without our agent inside of it. And then we'll just assign our already started agents equal to the new array we just created that doesn't have this agent in it anymore. And boom, just like that. Now players cannot start the same pulse multiple times and bug out. Other than that, what can we do? Well, maybe we want to have it so that the mesh component along with the VFX inside of our objective pulse can only be shown to the player whenever it's started, so that only the player that has it activated can actually see it. So to do that, we can actually use two new verse functions that they added in the most recent update called the set presentable to players and get presentable to players. So what this allows us to do is we can set an entity so it can only be viewed by specific players. So pretty simple, we will write it's actually really easy to use. So there is actually one issue with using this, and that is we are adding multiple components to the same entity. So we're not actually creating a new entity for each player. We're creating new components, or new VFX. And we can only set presentable to players for new entities. So what do we need to do? Instead of actually adding, we're going to have to create a new entity and add it to our root entity here. So what I'll do is for the handle map indicator, whenever it's started, we will create a new entity of type entity like so. And we will write entity, which is our root entity, to this component. And we will write dot entities, and this works the exact same way as our add components down here, except just with an entity, and we will add it to our new entity array. Yeah, and then we'll add the array of our new entity. So now we have this new entity and we add it to our existing entity. So if we want to see what's actually happening, we'll go back into our prefab and you can see this is bugged out. Sometimes you can't actually see it. So let me just go ahead and actually open this back up again. We can see it properly. What we're doing is doing this, right click, add entity. So this is what we just created. And then what we want to do is add our mesh component and the VFX component to this new entity rather than our default entity, which has the objective indicator component added. So all we need to do is basically just change everything down here. So VFX component will make it so that it's actually part of this new entity, and we'll add the new entity.add components. So now this VFX is actually added to this. The already started agents, that works fine. Then down here, this entity, we don't really need to change because position is going to be the same anyway. And then here, this is also going to be the same because we're just removing it from the entity it's added to and not our root entity. All right, so now we're actually creating a new entity. What we can do is whenever we add this, I will then write new entity dot, and we'll go to verse and we'll find set presentable to players, copy this. So we'll write new entity dot set presentable to players. And it's, if we look, we set it to an optional array of players. So what that means is we actually need to get the player first. So what I'll do is copy and paste this down here. That way we can write our player is equal to player agent. This is just converting our agent to a player. But then inside of this, it needs to be an array of players. So we'll write array player. So now we have an array of players, even though it's just our singular player inside of it. And then lastly, it has to be an option. So I'll put option around this. So now it's an optional array of players that we're assigning this to. And then maybe just to clean it up a little bit, we can go down here and clear this from the player like so. We'll just set it to option array. And also there's another thing we need to do, and that is instead of just removing this VFX component, is we actually don't need to even remove this VFX component. Instead, we can remove this new entity, which will just remove everything underneath it as well. So I'll write our new entity dot, and if we look in our entity function, we have remove from parent. So I'll go down here and write remove from parent. So now whenever this map indicator starts, it's going to create a new entity. It's going to add the VFX component to that, handle all the logic for VFX with the player and moving and setting the position right. And then it's going to remove that entity from our parent. So the entity we created, it's going to delete like so. The next thing we need to do is actually spawn in the mesh component and add it to that entity instead. So I am going to remove our mesh component here, and we'll go down here and basically do the same thing we did with the VFX component, except we'll make it our mesh component of type. And we do the exact same thing with meshes as we do with VFXs. So what I'll do is go into my content drawer, meshes folder, and copy the name of my cylinder. Maybe we can rename it, but for now I'll just use this long name. And we need to assign the entity, which is equal to our new entity, which we're adding it to. And then we need to actually add it. So I'll write new entity.add components. And because it's part of this new entity, which is what we're changing the presentable, it should only be presentable to, or this mesh should only be presentable to our player. Okay, just like that, our script is now done. We now have a full setup component. So let's go into our game and set this up. I'll go into UEFN and first build verse code. And inside of our outliner, we'll select our Objective Pulse prefab. And we want to set this or position this wherever we want the pulse to go towards. So I'm just gonna go and grab out our, not our cylinder, but Actually, we're going to need another trigger anyway, so I'll use my trigger to kind of point the pulse. So I'll create a new trigger and I'll position it over here, which is where I'll say the pulse should point to. Then we'll select our prefab and move it over on top of the trigger, like so. Now if we go to our details, we have two options inside of this, and that's it. Our start trigger, which is already selected, and then the stop trigger, like so. And now we can go ahead and save and launch our session to test this out. Okay, so now in game, if I go ahead and click our start trigger, you can see we have our objective pulse that's pointing towards where we placed our preset. There is one kind of issue with the VFX. Maybe it's not an issue, but if you are really far away, it's going to move a lot faster because it's not going to cancel halfway through. But if we do go ahead and get closer, well then if we click our cancel trigger, then it no longer exists and goes away. There's an issue though. For some reason, our mesh is actually not appearing at all. So let's go ahead and figure out why that's happening. Okay, now I see in our verse code, we have our mesh component here. And whenever we create it, because I copied and pasted our line up here, I forgot to change the VFX component to the mesh component. So let's change that. Now, if we just build verse code and push changes, it should be fixed. Okay, so now if I start and go and click our start trigger, you can see the mesh is added. It does look like it kind of adds it at a pretty high position, or at least the mesh starts at the bottom. So let's actually go ahead and fix that and move it down a little bit. Well, this is actually going to be a little tricky because we cannot set the position of a specific component, because the position is going to actually be the entity or the entire entity's kind of position. So the position of it is going to be the transform component of our entire new entity instead. So in order to do this, we actually are going to have to create two new entities and then set the transform component there. So to do that, I'll just copy this, paste it down here, and we'll call this our new mesh entity, and we will add it like so. And then for our mesh component, we will set it to our new mesh entity instead, add our mesh component to the new mesh entity. Then down here, let's copy presentable to players, but we'll do it for our new mesh entity as well. And down here, we will do the exact same, but for our new mesh entity, and we'll also remove it from the parent. So basically just copy everything from our previous entity, but do it for our new mesh entity. And then we can set the position of this new mesh entity. So we can write new mesh entity dot set local transform, and we'll set it to whatever the current transform is, and then move it down. So we'll write new mesh entity dot get local transform minus vector 3, where the up is equal to maybe -50. And you see here we get an error because this needs to be a translation. So what we'll do is we'll just write our new transform is equal to a transform, and the translation, we need a translation, a rotation, and a scale. For the rotation and scale, we'll simply use the local transform that already exists. So get local transform dot rotation, new mesh entity dot get local transform dot scale, and then the same thing here, but for the translation, except here is where we will subtract vector 3 up is equal to -50. And now we just simply set the local transform to the new transform that we just created. And now this should just move this down by -50 units. So now let me go ahead and push for changes and make sure that that's working right. So now if I start game and go and click our trigger, you can see maybe it actually moved up a bit instead. So let's try messing with that value a bit. So instead of subtracting 50, we're going to add 50. Oh, it's because we're subtracting the negative. So yeah, this should be 50, or you could just change this to a plus. Either is fine. And maybe actually increase it by a little more. We'll go for like 100 or maybe 75. Looks about right. And the reason we had to do this instead of just simply moving this down is because we want the VFX component to be in the center and not at the bottom where the start of the mesh is. There's maybe another way you can do this by maybe setting the mesh's pivot point to kind of the center, because I'm guessing right now it's on the bottom, but just changing the verse works. You could also do the opposite, and we could have changed the position of the VFX rather than the mesh. And you can see, yep, this moved it down a little bit. We should move it down by a little more. Well, maybe actually just say like 150. So I'm not going to go and push changes yet. What I am going to do is actually add one more thing, which is another way for this to be stopped, except we are going to use if we look in our verse and we look for mesh component, they actually added some new functions called entity enter and accident event, which is very handy. And that's what we're going to use to track whenever a player actually enters this mesh. So what I'll do is go down here to our race, and I'll add another block, basically the same way as we did our trigger. And I'm going to write block loop, and we will write our new mesh entity dot entity. It's called our entity entered event. So I'll just copy that, and we'll do dot await, and we'll call this our entering entity, like so. You see, we still get an error. Maybe we need to add parentheses here. Okay, well, to be able to see what the error is, I'm just going to really quickly add a sleep. Oh, and the reason why is because it's our new mesh entity that we wrote here instead of our mesh component. So let me just go and switch that out, and then we can remove the sleep. Okay, for some reason, this is not working, or we're getting an error here as if this is not awaiting properly. So I will keep the sleep. I'm not really sure why that's happening. If someone wants to explain to me why this await does not count as an async expression, well, let me know. But for now, this will still work. What we can do is actually get the fork character that entered from this entity. So we will say if our entering or fork character is equal to fork character entering entity, and then we'll write if the entering FC is equal to our fork character this function is running for, then we will break, which basically does the exact same thing as the trigger here, except instead of whenever the trigger gets triggered, it's whenever this mesh component is entered. Yeah, we do get an error here, and that is because it's finicky and these are kind of broken. Hopefully this will be fixed, but the error is not actually an error. If you look, we can compile verse just fine and it'll work. So we're just gonna have to ignore that in the code. Anyway, now it should actually track whenever this mesh is entered and end it. So inside of UEFN, I am going to move our trigger over a little bit just so we can enter the mesh without triggering the trigger, and we make sure that's working. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and push changes to test this out, or we just need to actually push verse changes. That's it. So now if I go ahead and click our start trigger, you can see our mesh move down. Maybe we can do a little more. But if we go ahead and enter this, it should stop. Okay, it does not seem to be stopping. I'm really not sure why. Maybe you can't actually get the fork character yet from the entered event, and hopefully they'll fix that later. But I'm just gonna go ahead and actually remove that section of the code for now, and I'll add a comment to currently not working, and maybe this can be added later whenever the entered event is a little more kind of robust. My guess is that maybe you can check the fork character, but you can't actually get the fork character from the entering agent. We'll see. But for now, we just want to continue using our trigger. So I'll just select this and move our trigger back over it like so. So just like so, now if I go ahead and start the game, we have a fully functioning system, and it's only going to show the VFX and the mesh to the player that is actually activated for. If you see, we should not be able to start this again. We should only start it once. Perfect. And we can actually go over here, and if we hit this trigger, it ends it all. So now you've learned how the scene graph kind of works, all of the basic fundamentals, and how to build your own custom pulse indicator mechanic. It should be very helpful, especially for how janky the map indicator device is. It breaks all the time, so this should be a more reliable method. You've also got the foundation now to build countless other systems, especially with scene graph. It is an extremely powerful tool. If you found this tutorial helpful, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment below what type of mechanic you want me to cover next. And as always, don't forget to check out the Map Creator Success Program in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.